I've really come to understand that most of us, have these unhelpful, toxic, problematic patterns, templates that we keep repeating again and again and again. So what happens and why is this such a problem? And why is it such a problem in particular for women, right? I said today we're going to talk about the intersection between women, our relationship templates, and our tendency to breed silence within our relationships. Welcome to Confessions of an Ex-Therapist. I'm your host, Dr. Shyamala. As a former therapist turned relationship strategist, I'm on a mission to help high-performing women build lasting relationships. Together, we are exploring how to communicate assertively, think confidently, and show up fearlessly in every aspect of our lives. If you are ready to up-level the quality of your relationships, you are in the right place. This is Confessions of an Ex-Therapist. Welcome back to Confessions of an Ex-Therapist. I'm so glad you have joined me today. We are going to be talking about a topic that I am super interested in. We're going to be looking at the intersection between women, our relationship templates, and our tendency to breed silence within those relationship templates. So just stay with me. In just a few moments, you're going to understand exactly what I mean. So let me start by saying this. I want us to first understand that most relationships are not what I would consider optimized, right? Most relationships are not optimized. And what I mean by that is most relationships are simply functional. They are functioning. They are doing okay. We are, kind of going through life, moving through life. We're doing our thing. But these relationships aren't necessarily functioning optimally. And if you're listening to this podcast, if you've been following me for a while, I'm making the assumption that you have an interest, if not a pretty heavy investment, in really optimizing your relationships. You are wanting to have better relationships. So the place I want to start our conversation today is understanding that most relationships are in fact in a state of distress. And in order to understand what I mean by that, you've got to probably shift a little bit of your thinking in terms of what distress actually means. So when I say most relationships are in a state of distress, your mind might have immediately gone to, well, you know what? I'm not fighting with my partner. We're not arguing all the time. There isn't this sense of high conflict within my home. So my relationships are not in a state of distress. What I'm actually meaning when I say that relationships or many relationships are in a state of distress is I want you to begin to expand your thinking around what relationship distress could look like so that we can also begin to expand our thinking in terms of what an optimized relationship looks like. So for me, a distressed relationship is not a relationship that is simply in high conflict. For me, a distressed relationship actually has almost the opposite. What I've seen time and time again is that some of the most distressed relationships I've ever seen, in terms of my work with couples and my work with individuals and seeing people in their relationships, but also in my own life. The times where my relationships have been in the most amount of distress is when they are filled with silence. It's when they are filled with silence. It's when we are not saying anything. It's when we are not being open and honest and authentic, and we're not sharing what we think and how we feel and what we need and what our desires are and what's working and what's not working. So I want us to start our conversation by really expanding our understanding of what relationship distress can look like. I want you to consider the idea that just because you're not fighting or there isn't a lot of conflict or there aren't a ton of disagreements happening day in and day out, right? That even if there aren't a lot of words being exchanged, even if things are being swept under the rug, and actually, especially if things are being swept under the rug, I want you to begin to understand that a distressed relationship is not synonymous with a high conflict relationship. while a high conflict relationship might be distressed, a relationship where there isn't a lot of communicating happening, in my opinion, is a highly distressed relationship. So that's where I want us to start our conversation. And I promise you it's going to get better. I know this sounds a little doom and gloom, but I do want to set the stage, right? So I want you to understand that most and many relationships are in fact in some sort of distress, meaning that they are not performing and functioning optimally simply because we've never been taught how to be in one. We've never actually been taught how to be in a relationship. And this is actually truly one of my biggest beefs with when I think about kind of even the way that we run education and the type of training that's out there and the type of resources that are out there. There are so few practical, helpful, useful resources around how to be in a relationship, how to navigate a relationship. And the truth is that most of us come from unhelpful, toxic, and problematic relationship templates. So what do I mean by a relationship template? A relationship template is something that has been handed down to us from our family of origin. So this is the family that we've grown up in. A relationship template is simply a patterned way that we have learned to relate to others. It's a patterned way that we have learned to navigate our relationships, to move through our relationships. What emotions are okay for me to express? What thoughts are okay for me to express? What do I need to hide? What should I feel ashamed about? When is it okay for me to cry? When is it not okay for me to cry? We learn how to navigate our relationships. And ultimately, I believe that how we navigate our relationships is also how we navigate the world around us. We learn how to navigate our relationships from our family of origin. And unless, I have been out to lunch the last couple of decades and working with people, I've really come to understand that most of us, have these unhelpful, toxic, problematic patterns, templates that we keep repeating again and again and again. So what happens and why is this such a problem? And why is it such a problem in particular for women, right? I said today we're going to talk about the intersection between women, our relationship templates, and our tendency to breed silence within our relationships. So what ends up happening is because particularly as women, we've never been taught how to communicate openly and directly and assertively in our relationships. What ends up happening is we end up shutting down, or we become defensive, or we become passive aggressive. We begin to choose all of these really childish and unhelpful tactics to get our needs met. So rather than directly asking for what we want, directly asking for what we need, instead of, setting the boundaries that we need to set or saying no, we get so fixated and so worried about what others are thinking about us and how others feel about us that we use these indirect, toxic tactics in order to get our needs met, right? So these are things, like I said, like shutting down or becoming defensive or, being passive aggressive, giving our partner the cold shoulder, not answering that text message. Those are all indirect, passive aggressive tactics that we can get caught up in order to get our needs met without ever directly asking for those needs. So what happens is instead of being direct, instead of actually asking for what we need, we've learned to either play nice or to say nothing or to people please. We've learned that our role and our job is to actually please others. And so here's the real problem. The problem is that these toxic relationship templates, these toxic patterns of relating to others actually breed resentment, right? So these ways in which we have learned to negotiate our relationships, these ways in which we've learned to get our needs met without ever having to actually take responsibility for asking for those needs, These patterns breed resentment within a relationship. They begin to eat away at trust, and they begin to create a false sense of intimacy. Thanks for tuning in to Confessions of an Ex-Therapist, the podcast designed to help high-performing women just like you build better relationships. I've come to understand that the journey towards our best self is better traveled with friends. If you know someone who would benefit from advanced mindset, communication, and relationship strategies, I would love it if you would share this episode with them so that we can grow our audience and maximize our impact. So let me unpack that a little bit because it's a really important concept. Okay. So growing up, I avoided conflict at all costs. So I avoided conflicts at home. I avoided conflicts in my friendships. I avoided conflicts in my intimate relationships. I avoided. Why? Because I was so afraid of the tension. I was so afraid. And it's not that I was necessarily physically afraid of it. It was emotional. I was emotionally afraid of causing another person to be disappointed in me. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want someone else. I didn't want to let anybody down. I didn't want to deal with the discomfort of somebody being upset with me. Anybody. It didn't actually matter who it was. It could have been a member of my family of origin. It could have been my mom. It could have been my sister. It could have been my best friend. It could have been my boyfriend. It really didn't matter. I remember moving through so much of my life and constantly feeling on edge in my relationships around not making others happy. And it was something that I had, again, learned. It was a relationship template that I had picked up growing up, right? And so if you're listening, I want you to ask yourself, and I want you to identify for yourself, what relationship templates have you picked up? And have you possibly picked up this relationship template of people pleasing, of not being able to say no, of not being allowed to set a boundary, of needing permission, right? Needing to make other people happy. And if so, if something here resonates for you, this idea of not being able to disappoint another human being and that being this terrible thing, then what's probably happened is you've learned to go underground with your thoughts, your feelings, your needs, or your desires. You've learned to remain silent, right? And so what ends up happening is when we learn on a subconscious level to be silent about our needs, about our thoughts, about our feelings, about our desires, about who we are, we end up hiding parts of ourselves, right? We end up feeling resentful towards others because they are not meeting our needs. We end up feeling angry and bitter when, people can't see that we just need a hug, or we just want our partner to come home and say, "Hey, did you have a rough day?" We end up feeling bitter and resentful that other people are not giving us what we need. But here's the truth. If we're caught in that pattern, we need to take some responsibility for that because it takes two to tango, right? If we're caught in that pattern over and over and over again of feeling resentful or feeling bitter or feeling frustrated in our relationships, my friend, chances are you may not have asked for your needs to be met. You may not have been open and honest and direct about that. And that resentment continues to grow, right? It begins to eat away at the trust, at the fabric of trust within the relationship. And it creates a really false sense of intimacy. So what do I mean by that when I say it creates a false sense of intimacy? What I mean is that, do you remember where we started our conversation? I said that just because a relationship is not in high conflict doesn't mean that it's not in distress, right? So just because there isn't a lot of fighting and a lot of tension and yelling or whatever, however you would describe high conflict, Just because that's not happening doesn't mean that that particular relationship is not in distress. In fact, I think the highest levels of relationship breakdown that I've seen are relationships where there isn't a lot of talking, there isn't a lot of openness, there isn't a lot of honesty. Because in those relationships, it can appear that things are okay. On the surface, it can appear that both partners are quote unquote happy. And we can look at relationships where there isn't a lot of fighting and we can say, oh, wow, look at that. They've got this great level of intimacy. They get along so well. What I want to open your mind to is getting along is not the marker of intimacy, right? Getting along so well, quote unquote, is not the marker of relationship satisfaction, right? We can have very thriving, highly intimate, very satisfied partners in a relationship and also have disagreement and also have areas where we disappoint one another. That's what I want you to begin thinking about. And that's what I hope today's episode begins to open your mind to this idea that relationship distress does not equal conflict or high conflict or any level of conflict. Relationship distress can and often does equal silence. It often does equal people pleasing. It often does equal, not being open and not being honest. That is a real sign of distress that often goes unnoticed, right? And of course, if we're going to use sort of clinical or medical language here, I think that if we were going to give a relationship a diagnosis of distress, we really want to be looking for those markers of distress. We want to be looking for those signs and symptoms of distress. And I would say the biggest sign, the biggest symptom, the biggest marker of relationship distress is really asking yourself, am I being open in this relationship? Am I being honest in this relationship? Am I sharing my thoughts, my feelings, my needs, and my desires in this relationship? And if the answer is no, listen, I really want you to think about the impact, the long-term impact that's having on your relationships, right? And as we journey together and as we hang out together and as we continue to have this conversation, you're going to learn from me that asking for what you need doesn't mean that you're going to get what you need. Okay. I'm not going to tell you the full story on that. I'm sure we'll get there on this journey together on this podcast, but I need to say that now because I'm talking about the importance of asking for what you need and what you really need to fully know and understand. And we'll unpack this in another episode is that asking for what you need doesn't mean you're going to get what you need. And even if you ask for what you need and you don't get it, it doesn't mean you can't have an amazing relationship. Your responsibility is to ask. Your responsibility is to be open. Your responsibility is to be honest and transparent and not to bury things and bottle things up. Your responsibility is to actually show up in your relationships openly and honestly and authentically and to begin to break that template that you've probably learned growing up of silence, right? Your responsibility is to truly begin to show up fully and unapologetically and authentically in all of your relationships. And listen, friends, that's not going to happen overnight. It certainly didn't happen for me overnight. I am still working on this. There are still times where I find myself, keeping my thoughts or my feelings or my needs to myself. There are still times where I struggle to express exactly what it is that I'm needing or what I am thinking or how I'm feeling. There are times where I still struggle to express when I disagree with something. Right? There are still times where I struggle to say no or to set that boundary. But the idea here and the purpose of this conversation is that we're on a journey and a movement towards more openness and more authenticity and more courage in our relationships and having those difficult conversations regardless of the outcome, right? So I really want to leave you with some of those thoughts. So in our next episode, we're going to be talking about how to actually break free from these templates of silence. We're going to talk about how to show up more fully in our relationships. What I want you to take away from this episode is simply this, is the biggest threat to our relationships and why the large majority of our relationships are not optimized and not thriving. The biggest threat, it's not tension, guys. It's not fighting. It's not conflict. The biggest threat to our relationships is, in fact, silence, right? Not being open, not being honest, not being assertive. And as we move into our next conversation, I want us to really unpack how to actually break free from these templates of silence and begin to show up more fully in our relationships. Guys, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode. If you are getting value out of Confessions of an Ex-Therapist, would you mind doing 2 things for me? Subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode, and leave us a review. Reviews help other high-performing women know that this is the place to be to access advanced communication and relationship strategies that can truly transform their lives. I would deeply appreciate you taking that action for me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.